Hello? I think we can start. May I encourage those who are sitting a bit further to me to come closer so that we can have a very good conversation. And also those who are still in the lobby area, if they can walk in. Our apologies, we had to start a bit late because of other sessions that ate into our time. Okay. I think we can start. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the session on finding equality in the age of discrimination online, taking place here at the Forum on Internet Freedom in Africa 2017. My name is Kennedy Mugochi. I'm from Hivo, Southern Africa, and I'm going to be your moderator for this session. I'm standing in for my great colleague, Sylvia, who couldn't be here today. With us today to discuss our topic is Caroline Tagi from CAL. We have Fungai Machirari to my immediate left, who is a researcher, social commentator, and avid follower of contemporary conversations online. And to my immediate right, we've got Emila Gandhi, who is the public policy manager for Southern Africa at Facebook. And to my extreme right, I've got Daniel Kigonya from iFreedom Africa. He's the executive director of iFreedom Uganda Network and secretary for Gender and Disability at the ISOC Uganda Executive Committee. Just a bit of background to our session. Also, welcome to the panel. Thank you for being here. Offline, various forms of social inequalities and exclusion exist. Sadly, many of which are mirrored and even amplified online. In some instances, inequality is upheld by law, resulting in minority groups becoming victims of harassment and aggression. This has been witnessed in measures aimed at to curb hate speech, for instance, pornography, gender equality, and even sexual orientation. This session will explore the different factors that perpetuate inequality online, how to mitigate the risk, and also how this undesirable situation can be changed. We've got a few key questions that we hope that this session will help us unpack. One of the questions is, can one argue that online inequalities are proportionate to offline inequalities? Service providers and platforms complicit in furthering inequality online? How can we ensure a balanced approach in capacity building and empowering minority groups to effectively leverage the internet for advocacy? For advocacy and for equality. What policy changes should be pursued to ensure more equality online? And last but not least, what practices should be encouraged to ensure the online safety for those at risk, such as sexual minorities in Africa? I'm going to give each of my distinguished panelists here about 10 minutes to make a presentation, high level, high points. This will be followed by a round of question and answers, and I'll conclude the discussion by affording each panelist a few moments to wrap up. As we kickstart our discussion, let us not forget our hashtags. We've got FIFA Africa 2017 and also Internet Freedom Africa. So to help us kickstart the discussion, Daniel is going to put it into perspective, the argument that online inequalities are proportionate to offline inequalities. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Chigonya from Uganda. I work with IFM Uganda Network, and I also serve at the Executive Committee of the Internet Society Uganda chapter. So, yeah, one could say that that is largely true. Because if you look at issues of accessibility, and we are glad now that women can access internet, but how often does that access result into tangible results offline? How often does the access empower women to transact businesses online? How often does access empower minority communities, LGBTI communities, sex worker communities to advocate for their rights? You realize that the hindrances, the blockages that are put offline to these communities also manifest online. Look at Facebook, for example. It's easier for Facebook to take down a picture of a woman breastfeeding as opposed to taking down a picture of a man in boxers and jokes and, displaying their chest, outside. So all these inequalities exist offline and they still exist online. And also the gender divide. In most of African countries, it's very true. There are few women accessing the internet for issues, tied to their gender. And there are more men accessing the internet. And for even those few women who access the internet, don't use the internet as much as men use the internet. They could be accessing internet maybe to do Snapchat, to Facebook, to WhatsApp, but they don't access Facebook to engage into meaningful conversations, to engage into political debates, to talk about human rights, because they're still being held back by the same offline, offline challenges. Look for the case of Dr. Stella Nyanzi in Uganda, who protested against the regime using a Facebook account. This was used against her. Can you imagine how many women now fear to use the internet? The same way Dr. Stella Nyanzi did. There are several men in Uganda using the internet, the way Dr. Stella Nyanzi used the internet, but none of these men has ever been targeted by government because of what they posted online. But it was easier for government to target Dr. Stella Nyanzi because comments made on a Facebook page. That is inequality. And also, the whole issue of trolling happening to women online, happening to transgender people. The whole issue of, the issue of us having, more men control the internet, even these spaces. In most ISPs I've been to in Kampala, it's men dominating these spaces, dominating these offices. It doesn't put the issue into perspective. So to me, I strongly believe that the inequalities that exist offline, they very much exist in the online world. And of course, the lack of laws and policies to protect people online, just works again to hinder more people from accessing the internet, from wanting to join this particular space. And of course, if you look at it, there are no laws protecting sexual minorities, for example, in my country. How are they going to be protected online then if they're not protected offline already? So the laws which we have are discriminating against people. For example, the Anti-Pornographic Act, which we are viewing as largely as a tool for government to surveil and spy on its citizens, rather than promoting good governance. So if such laws exist offline, they also exist online. There are laws in these countries discriminating against people. So to me, I believe that whatever is happening offline very much happens in the online world. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. The internet facilitates communication, and over the years, we've seen exponential growth of the internet in Africa, especially in Africa. And there's this assumption that the space allows for greater freedom of expression as well as access to information. But from your argument, you are saying that this space is not as neutral as it appears to be, or it's not a free space. Is it so? May you elaborate?
Yes, so the internet space that is not as neutral as we might want it to be. It's not as free as we want it. When we still have governments shutting down social media because of elections, that doesn't sound like a free internet to me. When we still have other governments shutting down the internet because of exams, that doesn't sound like a free internet to me. When we have governments arresting women for posting their views on Facebook, that doesn't sound like, something neutral, like a neutral space to me. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to my second panelist, Caroline, who is going to talk about the policies and taking advantage of the regional mechanisms and instruments that can be used in order to reverse this situation. Caroline.
Hello everyone, I'm Caroline. I work for the Coalition of African Lesbians, and I'm the media and campaigns manager at the coalition. So I think this panel comes at an interesting day today, because it's the Global Day of Action for Access to Safe and Legal Abortion today. And a lot of activists and women's rights activists on the continent have been very vocal online, actually, if you look at Twitter and Facebook, about this particular day. So at the same time that I agree with what Daniel is saying in terms of access, I think we must not disregard the internet as a critical space to discuss things that are taboo, and especially in regards to sexuality and sexual and reproductive rights, such as abortion. Also today, Cal had submitted a few months ago, actually, well, more than a few months ago, last year, a request for an advisory opinion in front of the African Court on Humans and People's Rights. And we've just learned now, like a few hours ago, that our request, as well as like the request of many civil society organizations that have brought requests for advisory opinion on either the African Charter on Human Rights or the way the African Union intervenes in human rights processes, have all been rebuked by the court, basically. So the court, the African court, doesn't think that civil society organizations that don't have observer status with the African Union, which is extremely opaque process to obtain. Like nobody, like we don't know who has observer status with the African Union. So it's an extremely difficult process to go through. So even if you, like people like us that do have observer status at the African Commission on Human Rights, at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is an organ of the AU, are not entitled to bring any matters in front of the court. So this is like, it just brings me to, I'm just bringing that point because I think it's important to reflect on the fact that African human rights instruments are extremely hostile to human rights defenders at the moment, and especially more hostile to people working on sexual rights. And so like when we talk about like using policy or human rights processes to improve either the capacity of people to discuss freely what they want to do and like what they want to on the internet, or have better access to the internet, people who do the work that we do, and people who do the work that APC does and that CIPESA does, that defend the rights of marginalized people, have no say in how regional policy is basically constructed on the continent in terms of human rights, and cannot also seek justice and redress in the policy spaces. But we do have instruments that have been developed like so far. Like I'm just going to refer to the African Declaration on Internet Rights, and that has principles basically that we can use in advocacy to push forward sexual rights activism and like the intersection between sexual rights and the internet. However, the African Declaration repeats the same kind of problematic, sometimes language, that the African Union and African politicians consistently use on the continent, which is referring to African values. And there's no definition of what African values are. I think as Africans coming from different regions and countries, we can also say that my values are probably not the same as yours. Some people have an interpretation of African values that actually is a colonial interpretation of African values. So that include extremely conservative way of seeing the way we should be, the way we should construct our lives as Africans, and that is influenced often by the church and by previous colonial powers, right, in terms of legislations and so on. And so, in the same way, the African Declaration still, especially on freedom, the Article 3, which is, I think, like on freedom of expression, still has language that is quite problematic in terms of, I'm just going to read it, actually, because it's quite interesting. So, the exercise of this right, so we're talking about the freedom of expression here, should not be subject to any restriction except those which are provided by law, pursue a legitimate aim as expressly listed under international human rights law, namely the rights of reputations of others, the protection of national security, and this is where we have issues, actually, like, or of public order, public health, or morals. And again, like, this can be, in the context that we work in regionally on the African continent, this issue of morals and of public order can be interpreted in different manners by our various politicians, basically, that might have a different interpretation than of morals. For example, it might be immoral for me to be discussing sexual education topics on the internet, for example. Or it might be immoral for me to discuss abortion, like people have been doing today on the internet. So, and so I think, like, there's room for improvement in the African Declaration. And as such, I would call, actually, people activists that do want to continue working on communication rights and internet rights to improve the African Declaration and to refer to the feminist principles of the internet, actually, to improve that declaration and various articles. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Caroline. If I hear you correctly, you're saying that African human rights instruments and bodies, they are also hostile to advance our cause, especially when it comes to freedom of expression. But at the same time, there are also positives. For instance, African Declaration on Internet Rights. I think it's a question of how it can be implemented now. I know you're working at a regional level, Africa-wide, but I just want you to comment around the domestication of some of these instruments, because I think in other countries we've seen a bit of progress. So I think this is a question of municipal law versus by international law. What's your comment or what's your take with regards to certain other countries that are actually moving forward despite these regional drawbacks?
I haven't been watching very closely, like, countrywide, I must say, but, like, the reason why I've been talking about African regional instruments is because often the change comes from there, and then states and local governments will take action basically based on the resolutions from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, for example. So, like, we've seen progress in other, basically in different questions that the Commission basically works on. Like, just last year or the year before, the Commission adopted a resolution to basically to denounce violence against people based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And so it's not necessarily a resolution that says to states that they must decriminalize homosexuality, but at least it says to them that, you know, violence is wrong. And it's kind of interesting that we can use that resolution now also to address issues that are related to violence online as well.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to my third panelist, Fungai. For those of you who have been following events in Zimbabwe for the past 12 months or more, you are aware of online-inspired movements such as this flag. And Fungai is going to share from a practical point of view about this flag movement, issues to do with inclusion and exclusion in citizen action. Fungai.
Thank you, Kennedy. So as Kennedy has already mentioned, last year, Zimbabwe blew up into what we might call an atypical protest. A pastor on the 18th of April, which is Zimbabwe's Independence Day, posted a video of himself with the flag of Zimbabwe draped around his neck. And he went through each of the colors of the flag, describing what the flag had meant at independence. So the green was for agricultural prosperity, and the white was for peace, the red was for the bloodshed in the war, in the liberation struggle. And he was going through each color and saying, this is what was fought for, but as I stand today, I can't pay my child's school fees, so what does this all mean? Was this all in vain? And I don't think at the point that he made this video, he could have ever imagined what would come thereafter. But Pastor Evan Mawarire managed to galvanize ordinary Zimbabweans who had, for a long time, been very silent about their strife and their personal problems and issues, to come out online and say, you know, actually this is enough. This flag is our flag. This country is our country. And we feel the same pain and frustration and misery. And so from that video grew a movement, largely online, with Pastor Evan as its assigned by followers as its leader. Now, I wasn't currently in Zimbabwe at the time that this flag began. I was in New York, and I was watching it from a distance. And I could see all the tweets flaring up. I could see all the posts coming on Instagram. And it was a great, vibrant movement. We had young people going onto their Instagram accounts, draping themselves in their flags and saying, I'm Zimbabwean, and I'm proud to be Zimbabwean. And it felt like for a very long time, there hadn't been much pride associated with being Zimbabwean. And here was this movement that was getting people on Twitter, on Facebook, on all online spaces to affirm their Zimbabwean identity and to take pride in it. But I had questions from a distance. My questions were, was what I was seeing online translating offline? Was what I was seeing a reflection of the day-to-day life of you just walk out of your home and you have a conversation about politics or about life in Zimbabwe, and people would automatically know who Pastor Evan was or would know what this flag was? So I had these questions and this excitement at the same time. And I waited until I got back home to make my own assessments. Now, I arrived back home on the 12th of July, which is the day before Pastor Evan was actually put on trial for treason, for being in possession of police equipment. And so I got home, and the first thing I did was I went to all the places I usually go to talk to the taxi drivers I talked to, the vendors I talked to, and I said, so do you guys know what's going on? Are you aware of, you know, this flag and the like? And they were like, no, well, we're aware of strikes happening because there had been other service provider strikes that had been occurring, but they said, Pastor Evan, we've never heard of him. And it was quite jarring to me to realize that a lot of what I saw online was not translating offline to people I actually have community with. It wasn't like I had gone to a rural area somewhere with no access to the internet or anything like that. I was just moving within my neighborhood and talking to people of different, what I would call different access to the online space. And many of those who we would call media have-nots did not know about this flag. So it was very jarring and perplexing, and a little bit of a pause for concern for me in terms of how to build movements online in spaces, in countries where access is not universal. I don't think access is, what I don't know is if access is universal in any one country, but where access is limited and it's usually used for the utility of survival. So the people who would be online and making comments would be perhaps people in the diaspora, Zimbabweans, who are feeling a very strong sense of identity and wanting to be involved in something that's happening at home. It would also be people of a certain class who have access to data. These might be people who get data from work, or these might be people who have the access to Wi-Fi or other forms of internet connection. And so it begs the question, and this is just my personal experience, but then it's an experience that we can expand to a greater conversation around access and around movement building. And these are two areas, if you have the chance to look at the feminist principles of the internet, which were developed by APC, that are areas that we look at when we're trying to think of what a feminist internet looks like. So when we look at access and movement building, there are these problematics that we need to be aware of in terms of the fact that we are trying to build movements online, but sometimes we do not have the critical mass online. So I think one of the questions we've been asking is around capacity building and what to do to ensure that more people are aware of, firstly, how to engage with and navigate the online space, but also how to ensure that they are critical, there is a critical mass. It's actually universal, or as universal as possible. The conversation is as widespread as possible. But of course, we live in imperfect contexts where access is monitored, it's surveyed, it's restricted for specific purposes. Just as I speak of on the day of this trial of Pastor Evan, and I must also say that a lot of people showed up in their physical bodies to defend his right to his freedom on the day of his trial. However, there was a disruption of the internet that day, with most people connecting via VPN, and a lot of pushback from the state through telecoms companies. So when we think about movement building online and we think about access, we need to problematize it in the terms of these different contexts. We've heard about shutdowns. The keynote this morning talked about the very dire situation in Cameroon of an over 30-day-long shutdown. So yeah, I think there's a tendency for us to immediately call movements that erupt or develop online as elitist, and I think that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. Elitism, or whatever we want to call elitism, is informed by a lot of barriers, which are policy-wise, which are economic-wise, which are all these literacy-wise, various things that, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Okay. Various issues that are affecting how people can engage online and be seen online and be present online. So it's not a simple answer of we're online, we're here, and we can use the internet, and we can mobilize, and we have access. There are lots of things that we need to think about. Yeah, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Fungai. So Fungai talked about movement building online, giving a case study about Zimbabwe. And basically she's saying that even when you do movement building online, we should be aware of certain pitfalls and we should be inclusive as much as possible. Fungai, just a brief question. I know you were talking about this flag as a specific example, but you mind to comment about issues to do with online participation with regards to gender, with regards to age, and also even sometimes sexual orientation, do we have equal access in terms of freely expressing ourselves online?
No, definitely not. I think there have been recent studies, at least in Zimbabwe, that are starting to look at gender disaggregated data. But from what we know so far, definitely, access by gender, men have greater access than women. And when we look at sexual minorities, with Zimbabwe being such a hostile environment for sexual minorities, there isn't much space for you to bring your identity online and be guaranteed of a certain level of safety and protection. So this access exists with many different compartments. It depends a lot on who you are, what your sexual identity is, where you live, and how much you earn, what political affiliation you have. All these things come into play when we talk about access. So access always needs to be problematized in that way.
Thank you. So basically the challenges that we face offline also translate in terms of online. Last but not least, I'm going to give the floor to my fourth panelist, Emila Gadri. She's going to talk about how Facebook approaches online safety. I think we've had challenges with regards to many activists who get into trouble after expressing themselves, so much that some say there may be freedom of expression, but there may not be freedom of expression, freedom after expression. But Emila is going to walk us through practical steps that people can stay safe online. Emila.
Afternoon. Good afternoon. I'll not present until you all say hello. Good afternoon. I think we're too much nice food in this hotel, and no one really wants to respond. So thank you so much, Kennedy, and thank you to CIPESA and APC for organizing this event. But before I start, I just want to correct you on something, Daniel. Breastfeeding is allowed on Facebook. You can breastfeed and post pictures as much as you want. But you can do that. It's just the nipple, but we can talk about it later. So I just want to talk about how we approach safety. But before I do that, I just want to say, as a company, so my name is Emila Gandhi, and I'm based in Johannesburg, and I work for Facebook. So as a company, we want everyone to feel safe when they use our platforms. And when I say platforms, I mean Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. So we want everyone to feel safe because, as you know, our platforms are places where ideas can be shared. It's a place where you can express yourself. And not just so everyone can express themselves, including women, the minority groups. So we want everyone to feel safe on our platforms. So safety is at the center of how we build our products. And I'll just talk through 5 tools on how we approach safety. But before I do that, when Caroline and Fungai were presenting, and Fungai, thank you for reminding us about what the Zimbabwean flag means. But I was just thinking about what equality means online. And for me, equality is about power. It's about power, ensuring that all people's voices can be heard, the diversity of content, diversity of voices, and diversity of the people who are actually writing that content, and that also means a lot to us at Facebook. It means accountability, and not just for governments, and but also for us as private companies. For me, that's also equality online. It also means opportunity to different voices, to all groups that are excluded, to women, to LGBTI groups. For me, that's digital equality. So I just thought I should say that. And before we even talk about safety, why should safety matter? well, first it makes business sense because we want people to feel safe when they're on our platforms. If they are not, they'll go elsewhere where they'll feel safe. But beyond that, forms of violence, and this is language that is coming from my many years in APC, forms of violence online cause real harm offline. So it's not just when you're talking about, I remember when I was in somewhere and in another country and someone said, so when you're talking about online violence, are you telling me that someone used a technology device to beat someone or something like that? But it goes beyond that, and the violence also sometimes turn into the offline violence and real harm. How we approach safety at Facebook. So we have five tools. So first is the policies, and the policies are what you can and cannot do on our platforms. The community standards. So you cannot post your nipple. You cannot you cannot post stuff that has to do with hate speech. But there are some other, so it's not just you cannot do this, you cannot do that, but there are also guidelines on what you can do. So first the policies. And also under the policies, you can also report. So reporting is available also to users. Secondly is the tools. We believe that we give you the power to be in control of your content online. And you can control what people can see on your profile. You can control who can see it and when they can see it as well. The third is resources. So we do have resources that we are developing, but that we are also working with different groups. Just 2 weeks ago, we had an event here in Johannesburg just focusing on the LGBTI community and looking around how best we can partner with different organizations to develop resources that are relevant to different communities. And these resources are not just in English, because that's one of the criticism that we get, that most of the resources are in English. We really try to translate as much as possible where the resources are available. The fourth thing is partnerships. We cannot do everything all by ourselves. Safety is a shared responsibility. We need to work with civil society, we need to work with governments, and with other tech companies. So partnerships are also important. And the last thing is feedback, so that we keep on improving. We do have a blog that focuses on hard questions, and some of the questions come, from people who are in this room, and also feedback not just on that blog, but also on the experiences that you have. So those 5 things: policies, tools, resources, partnerships, and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Emila, for taking us through those steps. Now that you are here, and I think from the panel, you are the only one coming from the corporate sector, and there have been some questions regarding the complicity of the private sector or service providers in perpetuating the inequalities that we are fighting against. And I'm not just talking about Facebook, I'm talking about ISPs as well. What would be your comment related to the allegation, let me put it that way, that they are complicit in perpetuating these for the experience of business?
So I would not agree that tech companies perpetuate inequalities online. Like I said, and I think Daniel and Fungai also talked about, most of these inequalities also flourishing offline. And I think when we're talking about safety, when you're talking about technology, when you're talking about access, it goes beyond just equipment, and it goes just beyond technology. It's about people, and how we look at safety and how we look at security, privacy. It's a shared responsibility. We know the responsibility and the power that we have in this space, but we cannot do it alone. we all have to work together. And no, I don't think we perpetuate the inequalities that happen offline.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, soon I'm going to open it to the floor to ask questions or to comment. And may I also remind you about the code of conduct with regards to this forum, one of them being respecting each other's opinion, and also to discuss ideas and not people. And yeah, so just as a roundup for this session, Daniel affirmed that indeed offline inequalities translate into or they manifest as well on the online platforms. And Caroline affirmed that we have regional mechanisms and regional instruments, if I talk of Africa wide, but they are somewhat behind in terms of our cause, though there are positive signs that we are doing, that are being carried out with regards to the cause. And Fungai gave a practical example of a online inspired social movement in Zimbabwe in terms of issues of inclusion and exclusion. And Emila talked about the 5 steps in that Facebook ensures that we all feel safe online. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to the floor. If you can be kind enough to say your name and be clear as much as possible when you make your intervention or remark. I'm going to take about 4, then I'll give an opportunity to the panel to reflect, to respond, then we'll get into another round. If you can also be clear to direct, if it is a question, to the panelists in terms of whom your question is directed to. Thank you. So let me see by show of hands, in terms of those who want to contribute first. First we've got the lady here in front, then number 2. Okay, and Henriette, yeah. Okay, you can proceed.
Okay, thank you. So firstly to Emila, not to put you on the spot or anything, but officially Facebook is against discrimination and against misogyny, but unofficially we've continued to see sort of double standards in how you, I don't know what's it called, in how you stop this, this misogyny. For example, continuously there have been targeted attacks directed at women that oftentimes, even when they go reported, are not as quickly curbed as they should be, right? So just to, I just want you to comment on what seems to be a really double standard and just how continuously violence against women is oftentimes perpetrated through Facebook, and if there's any, if as Facebook you have any sort of concrete plans on how to end this, right? And then to Fungai, really quickly, I come from a country as well where oftentimes online support does not translate into offline support. One of our key opposition leaders has amazing support online, but oftentimes it has just refused to translate into the offline support. And when the polls come, the numbers are really just sad. But I do believe that social media can be an amazing tool to begin to build the movement. But then how do we start to leverage our online support? How do we start to get people as invested as they should be online and then offline? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Would you mind sharing your name?
Patricia from Uganda, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm Maria Jose from Bolivia, and I'm representing the Internet Society chapter of Bolivia and UNESCO also. I would like to ask, there's a lot of polemic concerning the Facebook policy that you have to use your real name and your real gender, and or not your real gender, but I wonder what is going to happen. You talk about partnerships and networks and the work and collaboration with organizations. And I would like to know what are the future plans concerning the threat to anonymity online that affects LGBTI communities that want to use other names and want to use a gender that they didn't born with that gender. And they cannot do this because the Facebook policy says that they have to use the one that they have in the ID. So I would like to know what are the future plans of the organization to solve this.
Henriette and the gentleman here.
Thanks, and thanks, Kennedy. I just wanted to react to Caroline. You know, I share your human rights mechanisms are unwieldy. They are peopled by people who are often not rights advocates. But I also think we do need to recognize that we can and still should work with them. The language that you read from the African Declaration, that's horrible language. You know, anything about public order, national security. But that is the language that is in international human rights law. And when we drafted the African Declaration, we had a choice to leave it out. And actually, Article 19, one of our partners, made us put it back. And in some ways, it means that that's language that can make governments feel comfortable, so we can actually have a conversation with them about rights. So it has that advantage, even though we know they'll abuse it, as you say. But then I think also the limitations have limits themselves. And therefore, even though a state could make the case that they can limit freedom of expression to, in the interest of public order, there's a limit to how they can use that as well. Because if there's public disorder in response to violations of human rights in the first place, that also has to be factored in. And so I think for us as activists and as advocates, we have to make the choices. Do we want to use those mechanisms? Can we use them in a way to make them better and make them function more? And then also use them in a way that understands this game of language, of international legal instruments, so that we can use them for our ends. It's not easy, and it doesn't have short-term rewards often. But my question to you is, you know, do you think we should still do it, or do you feel, in your experience, that these mechanisms are so hostile that we are wasting our time? I obviously think we should still try, but I want to hear from you as well.
Thank you. And for this round, lastly, the gentleman here.
Thank you, facilitator. My question is on online inspired movements. Is it really a one-on-one situation that we should have statistics of activists online equaling the number of those offline? Especially in this age where we now have digital elections. I can read something from an online publication. Then when voting comes, I make a decision based on what I read, but you never see me in the streets. Is it a one-on-one situation?
Thank you. I'm going to give my panelists an opportunity to respond. Some questions were direct, some were general. So I'll start with Caroline.
Okay. I'll start with Henriette's question, and then I think I have a comment on another one. So I don't think we're wasting our time. I think it's slow process, and it's difficult process, and it's frustrating. But I think, like, especially as sexual rights activists, we have to be in those spaces. Like, we have to be in people's spaces, and say we exist, right? So my issue with the language, actually, I understand that it's part of a larger, like a general language that human rights processes use. I was just pointing to the dangers of the interpretation of values. Like right now there is like a huge CAL's observer status at the African Commission is basically threatened by its parent body, the African Union, because we apparently don't respond to African values that are in the African Charter. So there's like, this is a direct expression of how this term that is quite vague, African values, can be interpreted by politicians in an extremely conservative way to block the work of human rights defenders like us, basically, of being part of those spaces. So like if we block access to the spaces in the first place, like it's difficult to continue to engage. We'll have to do it from outside. But yeah, no, I think like those instruments are valuable. Sometimes I feel we're wasting our time, but I'm sure it's like a long, you know, like it's work that is like incrementally, very slowly moving forward. And I think there was something else also about like corporations and the ownership, basically. And I think that's an interesting question for us to discuss and to reflect on, is basically how, you know, like how as Africans we fought against colonialism. How do we see corporations that are mostly based in the north, like Facebook, being also like sort of colonial space in our daily life, right? Like we're all using Facebook. Most of us are using WhatsApp and Twitter. And how corporations from the north are profiting from the content that we produce and our minds and our ideas, because they make money out of the fact we're using those platforms and we're exchanging ideas with people. So that's just something I wanted to launch. I don't necessarily have the answers, but it's an interesting concept to think about also in terms of like how we see our decolonization.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Fungai?
I'm responding to this question about how to leverage online support offline. Just before I answer that, I also just wanted to flip it the other way and say, how do we leverage offline support online? I think it's a two-way street, and we need to think about it both ways. But just coming from a context like Zimbabwe, when I think of how to mobilize or what needs to happen for people to be mobilized in their bodies and to actually go out onto the streets and do something, well, there has to be a definite acknowledgement of fear and trauma, because we are a very traumatized nation. We have gone through a lot of ups and downs and disappointments and have just kind of receded back into ourselves and said, well, you know, let's see what the next thing is. I think all of us who left from Zim on either Tuesday or yesterday would have passed snaking fuel queues or spent time in those queues, because we are going back into critical shortages of basic commodities. So how do you mobilize people who are dealing with survival and fear? And I think also we do need to acknowledge that the rural strongholds, these places of critical masses of numbers of people, are politicized spaces. It's not like you can just go and have a nice, let's set up an internet cafe somewhere and like you guys can just have access to Wi-Fi all day, every day. No, they're political strongholds which are kept separate from the digital world for very specific reasons, because the rural population remains the majority. And when it comes to decision making, as we perceive real decision making, which I problematize a lot, I think we tend to focus a lot on elections as being the only ways that we can express ourselves. But then when it does come to elections and that sort of thing, if that is where we put voice as being the most critical, then people who are not online do not have the same access to the same information that people online do, and who generally do not vote in the same ways as the people in rural strongholds do. I'm not sure if I answered that question, I wouldn't say I have a definitive answer. It's an ongoing conversation. And then the second question was, should activism online equal activism offline? Is it one-on-one? Is it an equal exchange? I mean, I don't as well with this. It's more of a philosophical response. We embody physical bodies. So as much as we do our activism online, at some point, we do go offline in whatever way and engage with a material world that is beyond the online space. It just got me thinking a little bit about, I think in the gaming world, there's something called Second Life, where basically you have a life online. You purchase property, you have neighbors and friends, and like you actually have a life there. But then all the challenges of the Second Life communities started to perpetuate. There was violence, there was attacks, there were people's identities being revealed and all these things that happen in the offline world. So I don't think they have to be equal. I do think that for sure there are some things or issues that people will feel more comfortable to speak about online than they would offline, and that constitutes activism. It might be that, yeah, I do support this cause, but I don't feel safe enough to go and actually be on the street about it. Your activism is still valid. In the same way, if there's some things that you say, well, I think the only way that I can make significant change or contribution to a cause is in my physical body and not online, that makes sense. But I don't think we can ever try to equate the two. They overlap, but they also function in different ways, especially when we think about anonymity and we think about disability and things that obstruct a lot of people from participating in their physical bodies in certain spaces. Sexual identity as well. So I don't think that the conversation should ever be to try to collate, to bring those two things to the same thing. But that they should exist in the fullness of what they are, but have enough overlap that they bridge gaps.
Thank you, Fungai. I'm going to move on to Emila.
Okay, thank you. So there was a question here about double standards and what are like the concrete plans that we have to change our ways. That's what I wrote here, but I can't remember your real words. So, and you said you're from Uganda. So it's difficult for me to comment on the issue that you have raised without actually seeing what was reported and whether it was reported and was it taken down. But one thing that I can say is that there's a lot of underreporting in the region. And as Facebook, we don't actively monitor the content that is on our platform. With over 2 billion people on the platform, it's just impossible and something that we don't do. We don't actively monitor. So if you see something that you think should not be on the platform, you should report it. But I'll be interested to see what you are actually referring to before I generalize. And then what concrete plans are there? I thought that was what I was talking about in my presentation. But if you want something really specific to Uganda, then we can have a conversation on that. Sorry, I didn't get your name from Bolivia. Maria Jose. Yeah, Maria. Maria, you mentioned something about the real name policy. I don't think it's something that we look, that there are no active plans to change that policy. Facebook is built on authentic identity. You use your real name that people, know you through. You can use your nickname as a middle name for the username, but you use your real name. And then on gender, I don't know, have you ever tried changing the gender on your profile? Because it's possible. You can. So you can change it under your profile name, and you can also custom make to who is going to see that change. to everyone. So it's possible, and I can walk I can walk you through it offline, but it's possible. And Caroline mentioned something about Facebook profiting from African sweat. That's what I have here. But
Okay.
yeah, or okay, go ahead. Well, something like that. Is it still about safety, or is it still about? Yeah. But we can have that
Okay.
conversation.
Yeah, yes.
I think
we
it's
can
longer
have that
conversation.
Yeah, but all I can say is that Facebook is an American company, yes, but we are investing in Africa. We have an office here. We do have Africans working on the team, and we do invest in the technology ecosystem. So as a private company, like many other private companies who are also investing in the continent, and Africa means a lot to us, and it's a priority, and we are here in as much as other organizations are around here. But I would be interested to really understand how you feel Facebook is perpetuating colonialism and bringing in and feeding off African sweat and hard labor. Yeah, later
Okay,
on.
let me come in here. I don't think it was directed at Facebook in general, but I think it was with regards to corporate approach when it comes to issues factoring in our historical context as Africa, and also perhaps if there are also issues that perpetuate inequalities and so forth coming from that history. Yeah, I think that was the general comment.
Should I respond or not? Just a comment.
It was a comment. Okay, sorry, before I give the floor to Daniel, Fungai has got a brilliant afterthought after a presentation.
Well, I'm not sure if it's brilliant, but then it's just something I meant to mention as I responded about leveraging offline support. I think we also really need to reimagine what the internet is for everyone. You know, I think we all access the same internet, but we don't. Some people access sections of the internet. I won't, Emila, go into Facebook's free basics. I will stay away. But, you know, no, I don't actually, yeah. But then many people access the internet through tools like free basics, which gives you some access to the internet, but not all of it. Depending on your pocket, you might buy data just to be able to get on WhatsApp, to get onto different platforms. So when we think about leveraging and mobilizing people online, we need to also appreciate that what we call the online space is not one uniform space, and that different people are accessing different parts of the internet, and that also informs what access to information they have.
Thank you. Daniel, you want to respond? There was nothing specific to you. Okay. I'm going to go into the second and final round of questions, and also to remind you of the topic at hand here. We're talking of discrimination, issues to do with harassment, exclusion online. So if you can keep our interventions or questions within the framework of this session. So may I see by show of hands the last four? Okay, I'll give first priority to the lady here, and then to Mr. Thomas. And okay, the gentleman is second bite of the cherry. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Norman. My question is really directed at Emilar. You'd mentioned with Facebook being a space for authentic identities. And I would really like to hear sort of what Facebook imagines or calls an authentic identity. In part because I'm thinking about the trans experience, where for a trans person, their authentic identity is not necessarily the one that they were born with. And so the presentation that they have and the name that might be on their ID might not be seen as an authentic identity. So that's my question. Thank you.
Next to Thomas.
To Emily again, you say you are partnering with civil society. Do you have projects, for example, where you have worked with civil society on the ground? But I'm looking at grassroots communities, most of the work that we have seen going around is mainly in urban cities, in urban centers. And talking of non-discrimination and working with marginalized communities, I think companies like Facebook can actually help a lot in terms of investing in infrastructural development and provision that can then make sure those marginalized communities who contribute the majority in our countries are also able to access digital and internet freedom. Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman here.
Thank you once again, facilitator. This one is for Caroline. Earlier on, in your presentation, you mentioned that there could be some policies to reverse the situation. Policies to reverse the situation. But I don't seem to have heard much, because I feel this is one of the problems we are having, that results in like internet governance forums ending up like talk shops. We have a realization that there is need to do something, but that something is not done. So which policies are available to reverse the situation? In fact, since morning, I think one area I have heard where something is being done is the presentation that was made in the morning by Irene, where her organization is trying to bridge the gender digital divide. We talk about few women accessing the internet. So what are we doing about it? What policies are available?
Okay, any last burning before I give the floor to the panelists? Okay. This time I'll start with Emila. Then I'll go to Caroline.
I'll start with I think there was a question on infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure are you referring to?
Yeah, if you look at the challenges facing especially marginalized communities,
yes,
and the reason why there are no services available is because governments have not invested in infrastructure. And if you look at the appetite now to curtail online freedom, there's a possibility that governments will actually not roll out infrastructure out there so that the majority of citizens out there don't access digital rights and digital freedom. Because should they access those, then the chances of them remaining as their strongholds will actually shrink. So as part of maybe your social corporate responsibility, and together with other players, to what extent are you providing that kind of support to marginalized communities who can benefit from your work and your support in terms of also accessing these digital rights that we are advocating today?
Okay, so infrastructure in terms of telecom. So I'm in the public policy team, and we don't do corporate social responsibility programs, but we do have an infrastructure and connectivity program. And I think you're from Zim, right?
Yes.
Yes, Zimbabwe. And there are plans to work with that, and I'm happy to see Mr. Majgai here, who is also from the ministry. And it's a partnership, really. Facebook, as an American company, like Caroline emphasized, cannot just go into countries and take over government responsibilities, but it is a partnership with different stakeholders, including civil society. You also asked about different projects that, whether we also work on different projects. And I also think in my presentation, I mentioned that we work through partners. We cannot do it all alone. And we work through partners, whether it's government or civil society. So we do work on different projects with different partners. On what projects, then we will have to take this offline if possible. You had a question on authentic identities and trans communities. And while you were raising your question, Daniel here said, yes, because, we cannot use our real names online because of safety issues. And as a Zimbabwean, you should know that. That's what he was, he was whispering to me. And I think it will be good for us to have that conversation as well, so that we can input into different processes within Facebook and see how we can take it forward. So real name authentic identity is the policy right now. Are there plans to change it in the future? Not any that I know of, but is there an opportunity to have a conversation on this? Yes, let's have a conversation on that. Thank you.
Yes, Caroline?
I'm not sure if I said something about reversing policies, but if I did, I think to answer your question, I think there's multiple examples in our countries where our countries have extremely progressive legislation, especially in terms of gender equality, or have signed international treaties that engage them into doing more, right? So in terms of gender equality. I think the issue there is not necessarily that the policy isn't there, it's basically that it's not implemented. And at this point, like activists in different countries will pressure their government to do something. Like if I can give the example of South Africa, because it's one that I know quite well, there are laws and there are laws in place, for example, to address harassment, violence against women, violence against sexual minorities. It's the way those laws basically are enforced by law enforcement that is the problem. So, basically, it's still very difficult to be reporting a case of online harassment because the police doesn't understand when you're talking about, well, somebody's stalking me on Facebook. So I think there's a question of education of people who work to enforce the laws or to work to implement policies that is lacking, and in some cases there's no policy at all. And in that case, I think international instruments and regional instruments can be useful to influence our politicians, basically to write policies or to write laws that could improve things. So I'm not sure if I have examples of where necessarily things have improved. What I was referring to a little bit earlier is basically this resolution at the African Commission against violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And what followed that resolution was basically, let's say we called it a seminar, but where a lot of national human rights commissioners were present. And so you can see that there's progress in terms of where national human rights commissioners, let's say in Burundi, or were not aware of the issue or were not covering the issues in their reports to governments, are now doing it. So I think it's little step by little steps, but I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Okay, thank you. We are coming to the end of this session, and just in summary, a reminder that this session was about finding equality in the age of discrimination online. and we have established or affirmed that the same discrimination or exclusions that take place offline, they also find themselves online. And we've heard from the panel. I'm going to give the panel one last opportunity to just, in summary, a few remarks, a minute. We have established these challenges and so forth, and most of you are working with constituencies. What can be done to build their capacity? We're working with activists to ensure that we continue with the fight for equality. I'll start with Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you. So, just before I go, I had Karen trying to answer the gentleman's question, and another question just came to me that to what extent do these policies and laws increase access to the internet by women? To what extent? So, I just leave it at that.
Okay. It's working.
Okay. Yeah, so how do we build capacities? That is a tough one. It's a very tough one. Are we going to train people to come online? That may not be workable. But I think the solution for me is to continue advocating for open and free web. So in our open and free web, people can generate and access content. So for as long as people have content online generated by user-generated content they can access, they would want to join the online world. And also enacting laws and policies that protect individuals online. The lack of protection online is hindering very many people from joining the online spaces. But some countries have gone ahead to enact such laws and policies. How are these being used? We should see examples of these laws and policies being put in practice. We want to see someone put before before a judge answering cases based on these acts and the policies. Because my feeling is that most of them are largely redundant, and they are pushing people far away from the online spaces. So for me, I think open, free web, protection online, and also promoting the principles of net neutrality. I appreciate people like Facebook who give the basics, because where I come from, we have these very many data bundle packages. We have Swift. Swift is for WhatsApp, Twitter, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And then we have WTF, WhatsApp, Twitter, and Facebook. So you have these very many packages, but they're also hindering people from accessing the open and the free web. People just access parts and portions of the internet. What happens is if a woman wants to learn about menstrual hygiene, that is not freely provided by these free basics. So to me, it's upholding net neutrality, protection online, and also promoting a free and open web.
Thank you. I'll move on to Caroline.
I think in conclusion, what I could say is basically that we must, as people who defend the rights of marginalized people, as marginalized people, be present in decision-making spaces. And we must make our voices heard in the way that the internet is shaped, and the way that the internet is used as well, and how those decisions are made on the continent.
Thank you. Fungai?
I think echoing a little bit what he said, how to reimagine what being online looks like, and to understand and appreciate that our experiences of the online space are not uniform, and that there are these different ways that people are mobilizing that we should start taking seriously and looking at as strategies. I think Koliwe in the morning mentioned in Zimbabwe again a platform called PO Box, Bus Stop TV, and how they use satirical videos to get the message across about politics and to sensitize people about what's going on politically. So I think we do need to reimagine what we call this internet and what we call being online, because it means very different things to different people.
Thank you. Last but not least, Emila.
Okay, I think, what's the question? We need to, okay, last remarks. work with us. We do not necessarily have to braid each other's hair, but you know, work with us. Let's partner. Let's get feedback from you, and let's work together. Because when we're talking about equality online, we're not just talking about, you know, we're talking about ourselves as Africans. We're talking about having our content there, our voices heard, and yeah, let's work together.
Thank you. At this point in time, I'd like to thank my panelists. May you give them a round of applause for guiding us through this panel, for this session. Also want to thank CIPESA and ACP for facilitating CIPESA. PC. What did I say? APC. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, Andres. May this conversation continue, whether online or offline, during the course of this forum, so that the more and more we talk to each other, the more and more we find common ground, and the more and more we have capacity to face these challenges together. Thank you so much. We've come to an end, and thank you to the audience for your active participation.